Good evening, namaste, and thank you for taking the time out of your Friday evenings to join the Tattva Talks Soil and Roots Conference, day one, on the topic of migration. I understand that you had some technical troubles at the beginning there, so apologies about that, and hopefully we're all connected now. Tattva is an ecosystem for creative leadership where we nurture creatives and incubate ideas that are inspired by the paradigms of Dharma, an integrating worldview rooted in the principles of interconnectedness, diversity, and sustainability. This conference has been sponsored by Acorn Dental. Migration, a huge theme to tackle in a very short window, encompassing the histories of many joining today, including our panelists, as well as a discussion dividing public attitude and policy in recent years. I hope this evening we can delve a little deeper into how the experience of migrant communities has helped shape today's Britain and explore what we can learn from the last 73 years of post-war and post-colonial migration. I'm Sneha Purohit, and I've spent much of 2020 researching and working on a book on the British Indian migrant journey and experience, particularly focused on the East African twice migrant narrative. I'm incredibly honoured today to be joined by two prominent academic and public figures, both well known in their relevant fields. Professor Atul Shah brings decades of experience in business and research and an objective and scientific dimension to culture and ethics in the workplace. He has published numerous books, including Celebrating Diversity and Ethical Finance. Today, he is a professor at City University, London. Professor Shah's broadcast credits include Channel 4, BBC Radio 4, and World Service. His work has been featured in the Financial Times, City AM, and Guardian. Professor Shah migrated from Mombasa, Kenya in 1980 and went on to pioneer the Young Janes organization in 1988, which now has a global presence. On a personal note, Professor Shah has also been helpful in my writing journey. I'm also greatly honoured to be joined by Professor Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. His research focuses on resistance to racism and grassroots organisations. His published work includes the 2018 book Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, and his next book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, will be published in February by Penguin Allen Lane and is available to pre-order now. Kehinde has written opinion pieces for outlets including The Guardian, Independent, Washington Post, and CNN. He has been known for his, let's say, heated conversations on Good Morning Britain with Piers Morgan, discussing topics such as the whiteness psychosis and the empire's global effects. I particularly enjoyed Kehinde's conversation with Russell Brand, where they explored identities and the links to one's material home and spiritual home. Professor Shah, Professor Andrews, thank you so much for being a part of today's conversation. And just a reminder to the audience, please do feel free to interact and share your thoughts and questions via the chat functionality. We'll try our best to answer as many as we can through the course of the hour. So to kickstart this conversation, and I know we've done this once offline with the technical issues, but I'd like to look back at post-colonial and post-war Britain, a nation experiencing an almost identity crisis. Britain now opened its doors to a wave of migrant communities. The first arrived from the Caribbean, followed by Indians from the Punjab region and East Africa. Whilst their experiences and histories vastly differ, these communities had to build from the ground up through hard work, grit, and a level of integration. Professor Andrews, to what extent did these early post-colonial migrants share a collective experience, if at all?
Yes, so the key thing to remember here is that when in the post-war period, we often kind of think about it as we were invited to come. That is sort of true, but actually isn't true as well. The 1948 British Nationalities Act was really about white immigration. It was about Australia, it was about Canada, it was about white South Africans. It wasn't really intended for us to come. And when the Windrush sailed from Jamaica to England, it was Clement Attlee, the left-wing hero leader, and the left wing were no better than the right wing, really. It was a matter of degree, I think, at this point. Didn't want the ship to land, did everything he could possibly do to stop the ship from landing. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do because the Caribbean was part of the empire. It really was part of what the British nation state was. And that's why people migrate. And then Britain essentially has to deal with its reality that most of the subjects of the British Crown didn't actually live on these islands. And so the thing that unites all of immigrants of color from that period is the racism, the violent, open, hostile, keep Britain white racism. And that's why probably then there was more, in terms of social movements and activism, there was more cohesion, because we really were fighting the very, very, very same thing, which was just to be recognized at all as belonging to the nation.
Absolutely true. I know my parents were a part of that period. So, I mean, Atul, G, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, very big thanks to Tattva, to Sneha, to all the volunteers who really brought this forum together. I think the work that Tattva is doing is very pioneering and very necessary for today's society. You know, and I've been involved in some of those training sessions, and how new writers are mentored. Because writing is a way of shaping our identity and building our confidence. So hats off to all the work that you do. I think your point, Sneha, about the migration experience is that all migration involves risk, you know, and one of the problems, of course, with empire was this idea that of control and of domination. I mean, in some sense, we are here because Britain was over there, right? Let's not forget that. And actually, we welcomed Britain with warmth and hospitality when it came to our shores, right? But when we came here, it was like, the welcome was cold and there was fear and anxiety. Now, the good fortune of the Indian migrants was that in many cases, they came not as individuals, but as families, extended families, and even in my particular case, as communities. Now, when you migrate as a community, you get a tremendous cushion in terms of settlement and adaptation, because you are able to share experiences, you are able to help one another, you are able to preserve your culture and identity and create that space for that preservation, and so we were, some of the migrants, and I'm not saying all Indian migrants, but those who came from East Africa and especially the Gujaratis, we were really fortunate. And I think that has now, when we look back in history, has been a big help in our economic and professional success in Britain.
Thank you, Atulji. Moving slightly forward in time to kind of modern day, the last significant change in migration patterns coincided with the EU expansion, and Brexit brings to us a new crossroad, which many perceive has been largely campaigned around anti-immigration sentiment. Throughout the campaign, ethnic minorities showed a non-negligible level of support for leave, which was twice as high actually amongst Indian communities. So I'd like to ask, really, as migrants ourselves and sons and daughters of the migration journey, is this surprising? And do we have an obligation based on our ethnic identity to vote in a particular way? I'll open that one up.
That's interesting. I mean, I think it's actually interesting because the election prior to Brexit, there's that kind of rhetoric of, keep Britain Britain, and we want to keep. Remember, this is the interesting thing about Brexit is white migration we're talking about, right? It's Eastern Europeans, which isn't really new, because there are actually Polish people on the Windrush, and there were hundreds of thousands, probably millions, of Eastern European migrants at the same time as there was black and brown migration, which often gets missed because they're white. They just kind of dissolve into the society, etc., etc. But prior to the Brexit campaign, I definitely would say that for ethnic minority communities, there was a bit more of a conservatism around this issue. Yeah, we need to stop this migration, etc. But in the Brexit campaign, because it was so obviously racist, which again is strange because it was about white people, even the Brexit became about non-white people, right? If you look at the posters, that really the famous one with Breaking Point with Farage, and it's got all the Syrian refugees, the complete nonsense about Turkey's not in the European Union, but apparently Turkish migrants are going to come in to the EU. So because it was so clearly racist and so clearly framed against black and brown people. I think that actually shook a lot of people out of that kind of let's be pro-Brexit, etc. So there was some support, but it was pretty minimal for all groups, right? I think higher with some groups, but I think it probably correlates relatively heavily to some groups have been a bit better off economically. So I think that's why Indian community tends to be a bit better economically, a bit more integrated in that sense, and therefore you probably expect to be a bit more the conservative lines. But I think it should. I mean, I don't know. I think that Preeti Patel's parents would hopefully be ashamed of her, given that she is one of the most hardline racist home secretaries we've had. And it's not like because you're black or brown, you have to pro-immigrant, etc. But you should just know better, right? Like, I mean, it's in your experience. Like, we should. I do think there is a responsibility to understand these issues better, because that's we understand them because it's our family, right? Well, we should anyway.
Some interesting points there, Atul.
Yeah, thank you. Research actually shows that, unfortunately, in many cases, in terms of jobs, immigrants are competing against other immigrants. There is a kind of layer of jobs which is white and almost kind of preserved. And then there are many jobs where, in a sense, the competition is actually between immigrants. And that's a harsh reality. And unfortunately, Britain did not manage its corridors very well before Brexit, and also when people did come, if they did break the law, I mean, the enforcement of the law has been quite weak, of late. So therefore, a lot of people have had bad experiences with other immigrants because they are not following the law. But also it's a very complicated story. As Kehinde said, the media played up this. I mean, there is always a blame game, and there is a way, complex narratives the media wants to always summarize complex narratives in very simple ways. And politicians also want to do that. And they have been doing that purely to get votes, right? So, and we saw the big case with Trump and America, how he played it. And so much so that in the end there was a storm on Capitol Hill, a kind of an attack on Capitol Hill. So this idea of playing up, I mean, it's true, and in a way, the reasons are much more complex. People didn't just vote for Brexit for immigrant reasons. Some voted for Brexit for economic reasons, as Kehinde quite rightly said. So therefore, just because some Indians voted for Brexit, doesn't that necessarily mean that they are against immigration? It just means that they are pro a free trade, and opening of the trade. Yeah.
Valid points, yeah. It actually leads very, very nicely to the next question. As long-standing and arguably well-integrated communities that have been here since the 50s, 60s, these early migrants have strong roots embedded within British soil. Therefore, are these populations feeling entitled to kind of feel to protect this home nation? And are we now British enough to have these strong opinions?
I mean, I guess so. I guess that was what was coming through prior to Brexit, right? In the case of like we have to admit that in terms of this, like when you talk about the scale of immigration and Eastern European immigration, it was a lot of people, right? And that did put pressure, particularly downward pressure on kind of service jobs, etc. It did cause competition. Ironically, it caused competition mostly in places where ethnic minorities live, right? So London, big cities, in the kind of lower paid work. So I think you did see people say, well, look, we've been here for generations, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, and people use that to say, look, we should have claims to something which are here. We saw a similar thing with Windrush, where the scandal really is that people have been here for so long, they should be treated better. Unfortunately, when you're black and brown, you're still a subject, you're not really a citizen. And I think what the last 5 years have shown us is that we can expect what we like, but we're not necessarily going to get it.
Yeah, I mean, Sneha, you mentioned in your introduction the importance of Dharma as a philosophy for the Indian diaspora. And actually, the Dharmic philosophy is not about ownership or possessiveness, you know. It is about duty, about kindness, about compassion, and about living in harmony with others, you know, and living with family. So really, that kind of possessiveness about land, even about wealth, uh, is not very familiar in our culture. I mean, you know, if you think about India today, how many nations in the world has India conquered? The answer is zero. In fact, it has never even desired to conquer other nations, you know, in that sense. So this idea, you know, that, I mean, I'm going to be teaching next week to my students the history of the British East India Company, which is a 500-year-old history. And it was actually, a lot of your listeners may not know this, but it was actually a global multinational corporation with its own private army which conquered India, right? And actually then brought the British state to India and say, come and rule, right? Now think about that. These, you know, so even something as simple as trade, Sneha, Indians are very good traders. And what is trade? You know, the essence of trade is win-win, not win-lose, win-win. And the essence of trade is also making daily peace. You know, it's actually building bridges, you know, and this is why Indians are also good at assimilating, because they have that kind of trader's instinct, you know. But how did the British play the game of trade? And in fact, how they want to play it now, even after Brexit, is win-lose. You know, it's not win-win, it's win-lose, because there is that greed, there is that desire to control, to dominate, to possess. And the story, I mean the Anarchy by Dalrymple has just come out, of the British East India Company. I really encourage your listeners and viewers to read that book. It is absolutely diabolical how Britain operated in controlling India. So, you know, let us all, you know, understand our history, including the history of slavery and, you know, the Caribbean. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And even Britain, you know, there's a book called Bloody Foreigners, which says that the whole history of Britain is just a history of immigration. Yeah, that there is no such thing as pure Englishness or pure Scottishness. Everyone's, and it depends how far back you go, you know. And it's a brilliant book by Robert Winder. And he's right. And he says that actually immigration is such an opportunity to learn, to grow for everyone, for the host as well as the outsiders, you know. And so thank you.
Good points there. I'll definitely look out for that book. Thank you. So something that you guys have both touched on is the idea of community, and also the idea of predictable patterns of migration. So does the process of uprooting and rerouting have predictable patterns? For instance, having to deal with things like xenophobia or living in minority neighborhoods? And how much does social capital play a part in the integration of migrant communities?
Well, sorry, do you want to say, Kehinde, or you go? Yeah. First thing is, Sneha, when you are pushed into a corner, right, which is what most immigrants were, you know, when you're pushed into a corner, you have to somehow find friends who are known, who are familiar, who trust you and respect you. You have no other choice, you know. So I think that indirectly, we cultivated that social capital. You know, in some cases, we brought it with us as we migrated, but we also cultivated that social capital. Now, actually, you remember the famous quote by Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as society. So when you actually look at the psyche of Britain, especially contemporary Britain, you know, it is very individualistic and very kind of materialistic, and almost encouraging the kind of selfishness, which is also causing huge social and structural problems in British society. But we don't come from that mindset. You know, we come from the opposite mindset, that there is no boundary between the individual, the family, the community, and the society. All merges into one another. And by the way, even the definition of society in Dharma is all living beings, not just human beings, right? We embrace all living beings as our family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right? So when we have that kind of large panoramic philosophy, it is us who have something huge to add to Britain, intellectually, spiritually, in terms of harmony, in terms of solving Britain's deepest social and economic problems. We have so much to give. And I tell you, Sneha, I am a professor like Kehinde, and even to begin to talk about these issues in the kind of academic forums that I hang out in is so difficult, even today, because they automatically say, I mean, don't bring your, they don't say it directly, but your ideas are marginal. We have to talk about Western science. We have to talk about enlightenment. We've gone beyond faith. We've gone beyond consciousness. Dharma has no relevance to finance or to business. Those kind. So you're put into a corner intellectually, and then you have to somehow find a little way out of that. It's very, very hard. And Kehinde, you may have some ideas.
Yeah, no, agree with all of that. I mean, that's one of the patterns with migration, is that as a minority, you become it's your voice is marginal, right? And that is definitely one thing that hasn't really changed at all. I mean, I think one of the things also with migration, one of the patterns, which is really, I like, this when you think about xenophobia and racism, and now oftentimes we kind of conflate the two. So the backlash against Eastern European migrants, for instance, is certainly xenophobia. And pretty much every minority group will get that. Like when you come into a country, people will say, "Look, you're taking our resources, you're taking our jobs, there's a pressure on resources." Sort of the most xenophobic country I've ever visited is South Africa. I mean, South Africa, huge problem with xenophobia, where literally people are being killed, murdered over this issue, because it's a really, really poor country, but one of the least poor countries on the continent. And you've got migrants coming from as far away as Nigeria, which is like, I don't even know. If you went here to Nigeria, it's like the distance is probably the States. It's really, really far away. But they're traveling all the way that far down to get to South Africa and living in dire conditions. But because they're there and they're competing for resources, they're being killed, right? So that xenophobia isn't an issue of race. It's just an issue of competition. You're different. Racism is very different. This is something this is the pattern that sticks with you. So I'm second generation. Yeah, I'm second generation. My kids are third generation. They're still black, right? They're still different. They're still getting treated differently, and will continue to get treated differently, and will continue to be marginal. And that's the massive difference to Eastern European migrants, who, as I said before, been in the country for get loads of Eastern European migrants who basically vanished into the background. So one of the patterns that we have to deal with, you add race onto migration, and then that's when you get these very, very, very different experiences.
It's interesting you say that, because some statistics say that by 2070, Britain will have a non-white majority. So is that going to be the case, or will things sort of shift in a different direction?
It's interesting whether that will be the case. In fact, I'm sure there'll be documents here somewhere. One of the reasons that the EU expanded so quickly into Eastern Europe, so this is only EU is only a problem with Eastern Europe. That Eastern Europe is not really an issue, because you don't have the immigration issue, is because if you actually look at the populations of Western Europe, the white birth rate is declining. Some places like Italy, it's like going backwards, right? And I absolutely guarantee you that when I find the evidence for this, I'll publish it, that one of the reasons for EU expansion was because they actually wanted white migration from Eastern Europe to change the complexion of the nation. And that's what happened over the last, about 5 million, I think it is, migrants come from Eastern Europe. And I think Britain does still categorize them as white people, but you have these different shifts, right? So I'm not convinced that we'll ever see that, especially because if you think about in the UK is not really diverse. Like, there's parts of the UK that are diverse, like London's diverse, Birmingham's diverse, Leicester, Leeds, man, there's a few places, I feel like 10 places. Most of the United Kingdom has very few non-white people in it. So I would be very skeptical of any of these projections, because when I see it, I'll believe it, but I'll be very surprised if it actually comes to pass. Mm-hmm. And I think actually the States is a perfect example. So the States is supposed to be a lot quicker, but the States has counts in its people of color loads of white people from South America, Latin America, which really makes no sense. Like, white Hispanics are probably more similar to Italians and Germans than they are to black people or Indian people migrating in. So, like I said, I will be surprised if it happens, but I guess I guess it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, Sneha, you're kind of talking about majority and minority, but I think also we should be careful not falling into the numbers game. You know, it's actually about people, about culture, about creativity and diversity in the true sense. You know, and you know, we are not. You know, I say it again. We are not obsessive about power. Yeah, we don't want control. You know, we actually want to live peacefully and work peacefully and actually have a reasonable standard of living. And you know, like, again, if you look at many sort of organizations in our communities, they do a tremendous amount of charity work. Look at the Sikhs and the langar, you know, and the feeding that they did of the lorry drivers in Kent. I mean, to them, the sharing of food is their religion, right? And I know, for example, my mother lives in Harrow, and she still shares food with her neighbor, you know, today. And that's a kind of strong Indian tradition. But this idea of, you know, the most basic need of humanity is food, right? And if we are saying that we're willing to share it, and so many migrant communities come from that mindset, you know, and culture and those values, then we are actually saying that our interest is more in peacemaking and bridge building than than in power and control. So you don't need to fear us, you know. But at the same time, I think all of us, you know, we need to understand our history. And as educators, and I think Kehinde will agree with me that it's the state, the content of education, you know, if you look at the history education about our migration and about our assimilation, about our dharma, is so poor. And you know, I live in Colchester, which is actually a majority white town, right? But you know, I remember when my daughter went to secondary school, Jane Shah, they were initially, in the first couple of years, they were teaching world religions, right? And then suddenly, in the third year, they stopped teaching world religions because apparently they had no teacher. And guess who complained? The English, the white children complained, because they were really enjoying seeing all the different pictures, the different colors, the different variety of art, of literature, of stories, of belief all over the world. And they were getting into, and the world religions course was actually teaching them diversity, but then the school kind of stopped it. So in that sense, you see, this is the kind of teaching that should be central to education, you know, and not marginal. Thank you.
Touching on the education point, actually, we did have a question in from one attendee. So as academics, you are both reshaping the stereotypical narratives in your respective fields, though that is unfortunately quite rare within academia. How can education play a role in building bridges among diverse communities and broadening the
Yeah. That's an amazing question, Sneha, and I'll lap it up because I think there is a serious problem with higher education in this country. And that problem is that the education has become a factory. Higher education has become a factory and is not looking at individual souls and spirits with their own passion, their own culture and heritage, which they are bringing to the university, to the campus. Yeah. So, in fact, I would almost even go far as to say that research and teaching have become more and more separated. So, especially, and you know, a lot of our children aspire to go to top universities, and these top universities are ranked by research and research performance. But actually, very often, these top universities are the ones who care least for their undergraduate students, right? And I get very hurt when I see that, because when I talk to these students one on one, I see the huge, you know, skill, the desire to learn, to grow, to make something of their life, that kind of, and the desire to escape from the clutches of the past and to build a new future coming through. But then the university system somehow says, you know what, we'll teach you what we want to teach you. We are the world experts in this area, and we'll talk down to you. Yeah. And your job is to come and listen, and we will decide whether you pass or fail. Right. So there is no engagement as such. Dialogue is not there. Young people are not given a voice in the classroom, right? Even though they may be very bright. I have a recent example of an Indian student at Cambridge who is studying economics, feels very isolated and feels the curriculum is so out of date, and does not reflect his culture or his identity. And this is happening right here, right now, in world-class institutions. So this is wrong. At the time when we know how diverse the world is, when we know how diverse our student base is, we need to engage with that. Kehinde, please.
Yeah, totally agree. The university is not what we often think it is. I think there is this kind of idea it's really progressive and it's left wing. It's really not. I mean, these are deeply conservative, institutionally racist institutions, and we as academics we're very critical of the school curriculum, etc. But the school curriculum is just a production of the university curriculum. Like what comes out of universities goes directly into the schools. And actually, the problems of things like attainment are far worse in university than they are in the schools. So, for instance, if you just go white, non-white at school level, GCSE performance, there is no distinction because some minority groups do better and some do worse, and it kind of averages out. But when you go into university, even groups that do well in the university, like Indian groups, for example, at school level, there's a gap. There's a big attainment gap from not being white, right? So there's something happening in the university which is deeply, 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 deeply problematic. And then that gets reflected down through the school system. Having said all that, education really is key, right? I mean, that is the way in which, that's the only way. The world can only be as equal as the knowledge it's built upon. And so we do have to be thinking about, well, how do we have education? What can we do? And one of the things I always say is we have to rely on, can't really rely on the school sometimes. Everything I get taught, paid to do now, speak about, think about, write about, I didn't learn in school, college, or university. I learned it from behind me. You can see all of my books, which I got mostly from my mom and dad's house when I left. And what we actually have, and I think all ethnic minority communities in this country have a very strong history and tradition of community education. Saying actually, no, we're just you can't rely on the school to do that. So we're gonna have to do it, right? And that is one of the strengths that we've had to do and to build resilience. And I think that is really where we should be putting a lot of emphasis as well.
Really
I
good
agree.
point there.
I also think, Sneha, Indian parents, if any of them are listening, many of them send their children to private school without actually having any say on the curriculum and the running of the school. They actually think by spending a lot of money and sending them to the best schools, they've done their bit. Please, please, please don't. You are actually a big vote in a private school because Indians are a big part of the population, and really the private schools are washing culture out completely. I mean, in fact, the same student at Cambridge, another student at Cambridge told me that many Indians who come to Cambridge are anti-Indian. What's happened? What has happened? What has the system done to actually wipe their culture out of them, rather than as what Tattva and you are doing to take pride in the culture and heritage, so and these are the elite universities. So our parents also with economic progress are becoming culturally blind, and they shouldn't be. And that is extremely harmful. Their money will go in 3 generations if they don't protect culture, if they don't support organizations like Tattva, who are trying to bring culture to new generations and keep that. We are too commercial and too hard-nosed and have become very greedy because of the huge amounts of money we have made as a community in this country. And it's about time we contribute generously to new initiatives, to new artists, new musicians, new scholars, new writers. I have got zero funding for my research from the Indian community, even though all the time I'm promoting Indian business ethics. Why is that? What's wrong? Is that all our money and all our business? Is that all we have learned, that it is just for ourselves and our own family? What about the protection of the culture? What about integrating with the wider society so we can be accepted?
Excellent points there, guys. I understand that's a topic very close to your heart as academics and educators, so thank you for that. We've had another question in from the audience. Please do continue having those discussions and sending your questions in. So the question we've had is, we spend so much time defending our racial identity. We rarely see our national issues objectively from beyond the perspective of identity. How would you look at Brexit if you were not brown or black?
I mean, I think the actually the wrong way around, right? Like, we actually spend far too much time looking at things on a national perspective, when a racial perspective should tell, look, what does I mean, race is kind of the wrong way to put this, but what does my color tell me? I'm black, I got kinky hair, like that tells me I'm connected to an African diaspora, right? It tells me, for me, I'm via the Caribbean, and we think about the nation. My parents were not migrants from a foreign country. My dad was a migrant from Britain in the Caribbean to Britain here, right? And it's so important. And we just miss that completely. We're completely trained to think in this kind of narrow British Isles story, but it's completely nonsense. My dad just retired, and I have his first passport from Jamaica, and it literally just a British passport that says Kingston on it, because that was what it was, right? And once we understand and stop looking at Britain as the island and start looking at Britain as the empire, well, let's understand things a lot better. One of the things which I've always pushed back against in terms of like Black history is the idea that I have to prove there were Black people in the UK before, for 300, 400 years. Like, yes, there were, but it's actually not the point, because the Caribbean and colonized parts of Africa and India for hundreds of years was part of Britain, and everything that my ancestors did there was for here. So when people look and say I should be grateful for what was done in the war, my Black family fought in the war. Like, I mean, this is ridiculous, right? So the best thing we can do is scrap Britain, looking at it nationally, don't make any sense. Embrace looking at it through our diaspora, because that's a much better way to understand it. And I guess that's the point about Brexit. Looking at it through that way is the way to look at it. And looking at it through the kind of narrow British lens is the completely wrong way to look at it, because that's how you end up voting to leave something which is good for you, right? There's no rational reason that Britain left the European Union, as we're going to find out, right? But if you look, it's not all of this. There were other reasons, but let's be honest. A big part of this vote leave was yearning for this idea that Britain was ever great as a small little nation, little island floating in the Atlantic. No, it wasn't. Britain was great as an empire, and guess what? The empire's gone. And I think Britain, and we seem to not be able to comprehend that. And just understanding that would make things a lot better in the UK.
No, that's amazing answer, Kehinde. And also, I just like the way, the spirit with which you speak, and the kind of compassion in your voice, that in spite of the pain that your history has suffered and experienced, I mean, which we have not experienced, fortunately, right? You still have that kind of kindness, that desire to build a bridge and to work with others. I mean, I was in tears when I heard yesterday Amanda Gorman's, or day before yesterday, Amanda Gorman's poem from the corridors of the White House, and she is, the whole poem was about the future. What kind of future do we want to shape and build? It was about peace. It was about compassion, So it was about not denying the history, recognizing the history, but at the same time building bridges of hope, not despair, right? And I think that's the kind of spirit that the young generation are bringing. I mean, I just had my Zoom class yesterday, and I actually it was my first class this term, and I decided to play it slightly differently. And I said, I want you to give me 5 strengths that you have, and I had kind of the world in my classroom, literally, all different cultures and sizes. And I was just so impressed by the answers that came out, from the student. And they didn't even have to think much about it, They were ready, they were prepared, and they were different. They were not copying each other's answers. And they were talking about integrity. They were talking about honesty, and they're talking, and they were very idealistic as well. I was so impressed. And it reminded me of me when I was young. The only time you can be an idealist is when you're young. And if universities betray that passion and that idealism, shame on them. Shame on the universities, because that is what we need. We need leaders with ideals. We need leaders with passion, and we need leaders who can take us all forward, and in an ethical direction, in a direction of peace, in a direction of harmony, in a direction of community.
Thank you both. Really excellent answers there. Another question, kind of moving slightly away from that topic. Some migrant groups are perceived to have been more economically successful over the years, which we touched on, one being the East African Asian twice migrant community. Are they an exception to the rule, having had a previous experience of migration and integration, having moved from India to East Africa, and then the second wave coming here? How does their experience differ like that?
Exception to the rule. I mean, what rule are you talking about? Because it's Britain who makes rules for the world, and then actually finds its way around all the rules except of enforcing it on others. Actually, I think that East Africa was a very fascinating experience of migration, because the Africans did not impose their culture on us. They allowed us to be ourselves, So I tell people the canvas in Africa of migration was very different from the canvas to Britain or to America. And that gave me, I was there 18 years, and that gave me so much pride, so much confidence. And I had all kinds of friends. It was such Mombasa was almost like the New York of Africa. People came to the port. The migrants from all over, came to the port, which was their first port of entry. And they came with hope, with emancipation, with kind of expectation of new enterprise, new energy. And that's kind of the culture that we learned over there, we mastered over there. We mastered how to assimilate and work with others. We learned the language Kiswahili, and then when we came here, we brought that vast culture and experience with us. Yeah, Kehinde. And then with all those assets, to be put into a corner and said, why do you people eat funny with your fingers? Why are you vegetarian? Right? To be snubbed at like that. It shows that Britain still today is so proud that it cannot acknowledge the culture and the intelligence that immigrants bring to these shores. It's not just that they come to take from Britain, they actually bring so much to Britain. And by the way, it's a fact. Both of us are professors at British universities. We are contributing to the educational system and the process. We are building the future generation. We are giving more than we are taking.
Yeah, no, and definitely, I think part of this with there's not one immigration story, and one of the things we tend to miss because we just say, well, I saw people of colors, etc., is class. Class is a huge thing, right? And when so the rules are that if you migrate into a country and you have a bit more wealth, you're probably going to do better than if you don't, right? I mean, that's capitalism. That's just kind of how the system works. And so if you look at the Indian community, for example, who has more economic, there's still, I mean, let's be honest, there's still deep problems of racism, etc., etc. And if you look at how the Indian community has got that, has largely been through self-employment, etc., and not having the same access to employment, etc. So it's not like a rosy picture. But if you look at that relative success, it is partly that is the double migration, but came into the country with more resources. So you'd expect the people to do better. Whereas if you compare Caribbean migrants, tend to come in with fewer resources, right? So interestingly, if you look at the United States, however, where now the Caribbean migrants who can afford the visas to get into the United States tend to be more middle class, tend to have more resources, are doing really well, are seen very much in the same way the Indian communities here are seen, the modern minority, etc., etc. Then you compare it to how Caribbean communities in UK are seen completely different, because you're talking about a different class. And so the class element is really important. And we saw the same thing with Black immigrants, so West African migrants in the 70s, 80s, tended to be students, tended to have a bit more money, tended to do better, etc. And there's a big difference. But what you're seeing now is with the broader African migration, that's not the case, right? And you've seen that there's a lot more commonality. So it doesn't, you shouldn't be surprised that some groups are more successful, because that's how these things work. Again, it's much more. We have to look at this in a global perspective, and when we look globally, we'll just understand it a lot better. And there's different groups of migrants with different resources, etc., which explains why you'd have different experiences in the UK.
Absolutely. Yeah, really valid points. Thank you. A couple of questions in from the audience as well. To what extent has the experience of colonialism shaped attitudes BAME communities have towards each other? Don't like that word very much, so try not to use it, but to what extent does the experience of colonialism shape attitudes that we have towards each other? Have we been conditioned to think certain ways about one another?
Well, this to do with white supremacy, right? So white supremacy is a hierarchy. I mean, if you look at, so that the book this comes out soon, there's a lot about this in there actually. This hierarchy of white supremacy, anti-blackness is a key feature. Then you have white at the top, and then there's this kind of hierarchy in between. And the ways that Europeans have administered their colonies very much is to really make those hierarchies very, 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 very clear. So if you think about the role of even indentured labor, Indian indentured labor in the Caribbean, or the experience of Indians in Africa, etc., slightly elevated, and that creates tension, etc. That's what the tension was caused in Uganda, where people got expelled, right? But that's all created essentially by this idea of white supremacy and the way in which colonialism has worked. So, and you can still see those tensions very, 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 very clearly, unfortunately playing out on the ground level.
I mean, yeah, I would explain that in an economic way, that unfortunately we're living in a time of neoliberal economics, which has been a hugely dominant factor. But under the guise of neoliberal economics, we are effectively kind of modern slaves without visible chains. There's been, inequality has been rising, and more of us are actually struggling. Even the middle classes are being squeezed, and the rich are getting richer and richer. So when there is this kind of widespread inequality, it will create classifications, it will create frictions, more like, Kehinde mentioned class, but in a sense, class and economics are also directly related. Even the middle class are now becoming working class, and so, we need to understand the economic factors. There is research which shows actually that when you look at capitalism all over the world, the character of capitalism actually varies from country to country. I mean, I was just speaking to a professor today who said, if you look at Indian business, many Indian businesses practice social responsibility hundreds of years before corporate social responsibility was even discussed in the business school. It was something that it was a natural thing to do, and many businesses still do it. They still do a lot of charity, and they still look at their employees as part of the family. They respect their customers and suppliers, and they have very strong loyal relationships with their customers and suppliers, and through that they're building the business. So in a way, like the book I'm working on right now for Routledge is about inclusive finance, because actually finance is a very important subject taught all over the world, Sneha, but you won't believe it, it is the same textbook and the same theory taught all over the world. It's kind of an American version of selfish capitalism, individualistic capitalism, which is being promoted all over the world. And it is destroying, and it is damaging even in those countries where actually the business culture is so different. Yes, but the textbook is still the same. So the future generations are being trained to indoctrinated to think like that. The same is true for economics, and there's a big rebellion growing about economics. So, migration, a lot of migration is also driven by economics, so, it's a much more complex story, but we need to recognize the economic factors which sometimes overwhelm us, and change our attitudes and mindsets. Yeah.
Absolutely. Actually leads very well to another question we've had in from the audience, who have asked, if a community decides to migrate, what should they first focus on? Social, cultural, economic, or political capital, and why?
I think I think unity is the key thing, right? And if you look, and even like white migrants, this is not for any migrant community that wants to be successful is going to get like xenophobia is just like kind of comes. You should package that in. That's going to happen because there's always going to be kind of resentment, and so you therefore need quite a lot of unity. So actually, that capital, that social capital between that using that as a base. If you look at any successful community, all done that. Little Italy is a perfect example. Actually, if anybody goes to Little Italy in New York, like it's really little now. Like there's like 2 streets because what used to be a booming place for Italian migrants, they worked to get their full resources, built stuff, and then were able to use that to move out. And now Little Italy is like literally 2 streets. So that kind of social capital is important, that internal capital, because you really do need that in order to make the inroads. Because you're not just doors don't just open. There's to any migrant at all. So it really is important to have that base and that unity and support.
Sneha, I don't know if you've heard the story, but now that there is climate change on planet Earth, we are planning to migrate to Mars. Yeah. So then after a few years, we'll trash Mars and then we'll migrate elsewhere. So this idea of having a migration strategy and actually a migration plan, at one level, it's almost like saying, let's run away from the problem, right? I mean, I think that for many of us, we have actually planted our feet here. We've kind of built a family and a community here. And we don't have this kind of idea that the green grass is somehow over there. And that, when we migrate to that country, whether it's Canada or North America, everything will be rosy forever. I think there is an aspect where we have to accept that we are here and that we have to make of it what we can. What you're doing today through Tattva, through opening this dialogue, is part of building that kind of local identity and that local citizenship and sense of community, And I think we should continue to do that, and that's very, very important because I mean, it is true that actually in the history of Britain until 1985, did you know that Britain, more people migrated out of Britain than came into Britain, right? So, it's such a complex story, the migration story, that it is, this sense that, all these migrants want to come here. Actually, Robert Winder says that if migrants all want to come here, we should feel that's a compliment, right? That actually, but instead, no, let's shut down, let's close doors, and it's creating a kind of psyche, a fear kind of mindset, right? So, it's a complex story, but I think we should not lose our simple, timeless values that we have, which are quite universal values, and keep focus on those values, because that is what is ultimately going to help us move into future generations as well.
Absolutely, yeah. A final question. This one comes from me. What's next? What's next for Britain in terms of the migration pattern and journey? We've had 5 significant waves of migration since post-colonial times. This potentially could be the 6th major change. So what do you see, predict for the?
I think that I don't know. I mean, it depends. A lot of that it's so difficult sometimes to predict this. Certainly, we want this government has made it very, very clear that we want less immigration is the key way to go. But as Atul said, like uh, people leave a lot. People leave Britain regularly, and that's not unlikely to continue happening. I think what might happen actually, and probably there was a question internet. The last question might have been internet that is the children of the colonies might go back to the colonies. I mean, I think there's a lot because of the problems we have in here. There has been a lot of me saying, well, actually, you know what, let's go and set up in Africa, let's go back to India and do so. We got more opportunities actually outside of Britain than there are in Britain. I think that's certainly something to look at, and particularly because if you look at places like the Caribbean, places like Africa, etc., kind of need people and have opportunities. So that's definitely one of the things which I'd look at. And I would also caution, I would really say there is a strong desire in this country from the people that run the country and powers that be to keep Britain white. And so I would definitely say that whatever the demographic strategy is in the next few years, it will probably be to increase white migration and to decrease black and brown migration. In fact, that has been the policy of this government, of any of successive governments since 1962, since the Commonwealth Immigrants Act. There really has been a really clear agenda to treat white migration, to encourage white migration and to discourage black and brown migration. And I don't think there's any reason to suspect that will change.
Sneha, we are going through dramatic climate change. Yeah, that's not next, that's now.
Yeah.
The human species on this planet is being threatened, right? Forget about migration. You can't escape climate change by going to California. If you did that, you would have been burnt, in certain parts of California. And yes, this is one of the richest states in the richest country in the world, but no amount of wealth could fight those forest fires. So let's just get real. Let's just get real. Let's say that and science has said it, we are living in the age of the Anthropocene. The human species has done irreversible damage to this planet. Please, let's check our arrogance as a human community. And also, let's curb this mindset that, we can migrate from one country to another with a recipe book and choose certain aspects of certain countries, there is a lot of good about Britain. There is a lot of bad about Britain. If Britain tries to marginalize us, let's fight. Let's fight as university professors through our education. Let's fight as lawyers through our law, as accountants through our accounting. I mean, I've met so many people, clients of Indian accountants who say that, my accountant is like my brother. I trust them and they always give me the advice which is in my best interests. I mean, that is a statement. To be able to trust somebody. Trust has declined so much, in modern business, and partly because of the large banks and the corruption that still goes on inside this institution. So I think let's just, stay real and stay focused on what we are here to do, and let's work together and let's build those bridges and let's build a future here.
Thank you both so much. I know we've run over slightly, but we did start late this evening, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody who's joined via various media platforms and who've participated in this discussion. I know this is merely the start of an ongoing conversation among migrant communities on their respective journey, identity and voice to shape tomorrow's Britain. So Professor Andrews, Professor Shah, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to be a part of this conversation and for providing your insight and valuable perspectives. Some of the key take-homes that really resonated with me were on the topics of unity that both of you really did show through that conversation, and looking at the empire from the diaspora as opposed to Britain as a sort of siloed island. I thought that was a really valid point. And also the point around knowledge, and actually it's only when we increase our knowledge, whether that's through academia or actually through communities and through family and at home and in your own environment. That's where we can grow and have our stamp on whichever realm that we end up working in. So if you'd like to know more about Dattva or have any thoughts or ideas about what we spoke about today, drop us a line on hello@dattva.org.uk, and we'll be posting a link on the YouTube channel to submit your thoughts. Just a reminder that tomorrow morning, 10:30 a.m., we have a second panel discussion on integration as part of this Soil and Roots conference. So just leaves me to say thank you again to both of you, and wishing everybody a wonderful evening on behalf of the Dattva Network. Thank you for joining.
And thanks to Harsha behind the scenes, doing amazing work.